me grab this so I can move around. Sorry about the noise. So as you heard, my name is Dalgleish, and yes, I'm from Melbourne, Australia, so if I pass out on the stage, I apologise in advance. I had a very long trip to get here. So I'm here today to talk to you about the case for CSS modules, or I guess more importantly, where it came from, what it means for the world of CSS and front-end programming, and more importantly for such a smart crowd as this, where can we together take it in the future? So to really put it in its proper context, I really want to take a step back to the beginning. For me, the beginning of my career. For me, it started with this book. Now, this is, from what I understand, not a classic book. It was just a random book I picked up off a shelf in '99. At the time, I wasn't into programming really at all. I dabbled, but for me, I was really interested in the web. And the obvious place to start for me was HTML. There was a chapter in there, chapter 13, it was very small, that introduced CSS. I won't read this out, but the summary really is that they were saying that CSS wasn't quite ready for prime time, but it was really going to change things. So, CSS has come a long way since then. For me, I really fell in love with CSS around the time I saw this project called CSS Zen Garden, which is around to this day. And it really proved out the real idea behind CSS, which was separating your presentation from your semantic markup. Because given a document with semantic tags in it, you were free to kind of change up the way it looked purely by changing the CSS. And in a world of table-based layouts, this was a real game changer, and it really changed the way we think about structuring our websites. But that design pattern really highlights a big difference between two different ways of working, which is documents and web apps. I'm sure most of us in this room are now working in the web app space. When you work with documents, the model pioneered by things like CSS Zen Garden maybe don't make as much sense. Documents have a very different way of thinking. When you want to style the way a document looks, thinking globally makes sense. You want to be able to change every header on the page, every paragraph, every bullet list, and so on. But when it comes to building single-page apps with CSS, you've got this big contrast between the global scope, the true nature of CSS and what it was designed to solve, versus the maintenance of a big, complex application. I'm sure we've all been there. Over the years, we've seen a lot of different approaches come out of the CSS community to try and solve this. The one that really kicked it off was OOCSS, but we've also seen SMAX, BEM, Suit, and now, of course, in the React community, more controversially, inline styles. The big one, I think, that has the most usage in production is BEM, Block Element Modifier, and it's ultimately just a naming convention. It's just putting restrictions on yourself so that when you style the page, you're trying to scope your selectors down to a single class with a strict naming convention that tells you you're targeting a specific block or section of the page, elements within it, and then modifiers for the different states that they're in. When you use that in a bunch of HTML like this, things got quite noisy, and I know for a lot of people this is where it ended. They couldn't get past the aesthetics of it, but this came with a lot of benefits because it really brought some missing structure to our CSS, and code bases weren't just degrading over time, but they actually became maintainable or actually able to be refactored, which I'm sure many of us have experienced. The older style of CSS was basically impossible to refactor it without breaking something. And we're now well and truly within the age of components. We've got web components coming to browsers now, Polymer's polyfilling that, Angular has its directives, but given this crowd, I think it doesn't really take much explanation to say that React is really making a big impact in this space right now. React is all about components all the way down. Your entire app is a component. And we don't have special types of components like controllers and so on. They're all just components to us. But interestingly enough, components are nothing new. They weren't invented in React. They certainly weren't invented on the web. But from the earliest days of the web, we had a bunch of built-in components. Of course, we've got things like select boxes, which give you a lot of rich interactivity with a simple tag. You just drop it in the page, and there's a lot of behavior you get for free. The HTML5 date picker is another example, which it varies depending on the platform you're on. You get a lot of stuff for free with these tags and a very, very simple usage of them, just dropping a tag in. But for the purposes of this talk, I really want to highlight the fact that when you use these things, CSS and images are private to the component. They're completely abstracted away from you. The implementation details are just not important to you. You just describe that you want a date picker, you want a select box. That, of course, was not true if you use third-party components. I'm going to take the canonical example of the jQuery UI date picker. You just want a simple date picker, and you've got over a dozen files, lots of images, CSS, JavaScript, and you've got to navigate this maze of files and figure out how to integrate it into your page. It wasn't too difficult, but you were really confronted with all of this implementation detail. And our tools reflected this mindset, over the years. We really held on to this notion of treating our asset types differently in their own little silos. Gulp is a really popular front-end build tool, but really it encourages this mindset by forcing you to think about your asset types as a series of disparate streams. It's very common for you to have a JavaScript build task that might run it through Browserify and Uglify and so on. You have your CSS task that's only thinking about your CSS, your images, and so on. And when you look at a tool like Sass, for example, this, again, is something that's purely focused on only one asset type. It's thinking about your CSS. And big complex applications have trees of CSS that depend on other smaller CSS files. And so what that ends up creating in your project is something like this, an index.scss, which is just a wall of imports, pulling in all the smaller files, and then you have a big tree of CSS but no other asset types. So then what does tooling look like in the component age? In the React community, the de facto standard at the moment for build tools seems to be Webpack. And that first time you really get your head around Webpack, it completely changes the way you think about structuring your applications. Because what Webpack does, it makes you think about that single dependency tree, starting right at the root of your index.js file and traversing all the way through your different asset types. So with React, it's very common when it's used with Webpack to make the first line of a component a require call to bring in the required CSS file to make the component that we're exporting actually work. So you'll see here we've got class names starting with my component. In order to make that work, we need to pull in its related CSS file. For the first time, the relationship between this component and the CSS that's needed to render it correctly is right there in the code rather than in your head. That does wonders for maintainability and really helps the code base scale really, really well. While at the same time, you maintain that simple interface that we experience with the built-in components, where if you want to use this component, you just import it in JavaScript with the React flavor that we have here, and you can just export it, render it out, and you don't have to worry about the internals. The fact that it might use a bunch of CSS files, or one, or none, or lots of images or fonts, we don't really have to care when we actually want to import it and render it. Now, I work at a company in Australia called Seek, which the #1 job site there. They're a household name. Whoa, I nearly fell off the stage. Okay. There's a big piece missing here. Okay, I'll be careful. Now, we were very interested in React, not because we could jump on a bandwagon, because it was actually solving some real problems for us. We wanted to have rich, progressive single-page apps. We wanted to have all the benefits of a single-page app, where it felt fluid like a native application, but it had that solid foundation of a server-rendered app, where it's completely crawlable. You could view source and see all the content that you could see on the screen was right there. It meant performance was much better because the first thing you see is not a loading indicator, it's the actual jobs you were searching for. It's overall something that really opened up some amazing new doors for us. And so we started working on this at a work hackathon. And for us, there were some really important requirements to make that work. We needed server-rendered CSS, which meant our CSS couldn't depend on anything running in the browser, like JavaScript affecting styles. For that, we needed hover, focus, and active, so that the page actually came to life immediately. There wasn't a delay before it became interactive. Media queries, of course, are really important for this, because if you render the page on your phone, it needs to look correct right off the bat. We wanted to have CSS animation there so that when things were loading, we could have nice fluid loading indicators. And more interestingly, perhaps controversially, we wanted to at least have the option to have pseudo classes for non-JS interactions. Now, I'm sure quite a few of you are wondering what exactly I mean by that, and so I've prepared a little demonstration. Here I have this little cartoon rocket sitting on the moon. I'm just going to click it, and you'll see it launches, and we've got a few things moving at different speeds. Now, that's not terribly exciting, except for the fact that that required no JavaScript. That was just a big checkbox hack. And if you're unfamiliar with checkbox hacks, let me just click the checkbox again and reverse it. So that rocket was actually a label for a checkbox. And if you know anything about HTML, you know that clicking a label also changes the value of the checkbox. So when you play with this technique, what you can do is, more practically, you can make it so that your menu on mobile is hidden off screen. And when you click the little hamburger menu icon, what you're actually doing is clicking on a label for a checkbox that changes, that makes that second rule apply, which is getting rid of the transform. You can transition from one state to another. Now, this is really important for those primary interactions, something like a menu, where you don't want to block users from opening the menu until 400 kilobytes of JavaScript downloads. It makes a lot more sense to just make it a standard part of the styling. And that's something that we definitely wanted to leverage for the primary interactions in our app. So interesting enough for us, this was in late 2014, and something else really important happened at this time. There was a presentation from Christopher Chadeau from Facebook, and he said that CSS has fundamental flaws at scale that can be solved by writing styles in JavaScript. This is the most memorable slide from that talk, which ran through the problems with CSS at scale. And this one slide caused a Cambrian explosion, much like we saw with Flux implementations. Lots of people trying to solve the problem of CSS at scale by addressing these points in particular. And I'm certainly one of those people that really had to reevaluate what we were doing with CSS. And I was really excited about the future that this opened up. Michele Bertoli, I hope I said that right, who I believe is watching on the stream now, he created a really great project called CSS and JS that runs through all of the different projects that people have submitted to him that are attacking these exact problems. You can go have a look now. This is just the top of a very long table, all the different projects, their versions, the different features that they have. It's worth noting that more X's doesn't mean it's better, it's just there's trade-offs here. Now, for me, the library that really inspired me early on was React Style by Andre Pop, who I believe is in this room. Can you raise your hand? You here? Yeah. Hi. Thank you. I didn't know he was going to be here, so that's really cool. So React Style was the first CSS and JS library that I kind of had a close look at. I run MelbJS in Melbourne, and I actually got one of our regulars to give a talk on React Style when this was brand new, and there was a lot of buzz in the air for this approach. So basically the idea, I mean, it's kind of old news now, but the idea is that you would build up your style sheet in JavaScript, and then you could just attach it inline to the elements in a very familiar fashion. But for me, what really sold me on it is that you could do server-rendered CSS because it came with a Webpack plugin to extract those styles and generate CSS files. That was really exciting to me because it meant it was going some way to addressing these problems that I'd raised that, for us were really important in our project. But there was, again, some trade-offs with this approach. It didn't have media query support. It does now, but at the time it didn't. Didn't have any CSS animations, which was going to cause trouble for us. But most importantly, as you saw with my crazy rocket example, we needed pseudo classes. And unfortunately, React Style made a choice of not supporting these. And this was actually a common thread. If you really want to go all in on inline styles, it makes sense to not support pseudo classes. So there was a bit of a challenge for us in adopting these approaches. And yet, when we looked at these things and we really thought about what they were solving, what they were doing for us, particularly in the long-term maintainability of a project, and we couldn't help but want it. Like, it didn't solve all of our problems, but there was just something to it, right? Like, it made a lot of sense. So for us, we found ourselves kind of caught between these two worlds, and we were asking ourselves, how do we embrace the inline style mindset even though we're stuck in this bad old world of regular CSS? We don't hate CSS, let me clarify. So for us, the answer lay in something I've already touched on, which is BEM, Block Element Modifier. So the idea for us was really to recognize that the abstraction in BEM, the block, is really the same as a component. It's really the same thing. And that means these two approaches really go well together nicely. So for us, we followed a very strict rule, which was that we would never use a block outside a component of the same name. So what that meant is for any given CSS file in our application, you would see right next to it is the JavaScript for it with the same file name, and that formed a component boundary. So that was our React component held together with Webpack. And I'm sure it goes without saying that this, of course, scales nicely into a tree structure that forms the basis of your whole application. But it's fractal all the way down. You've got CSS files for each component all the way through your application. And if you drill down into the file system, again, you can see that you've got this repetition in name. You've got the same, you've got the component directory, and inside you've got its JavaScript and its matching CSS file. Any images it needs are scoped there. You look into that CSS file, and all you'll see are rules of the same name. Everything's prefixed with that exact same component name, and this makes maintainability much, much better. But for us, one thing that's really interesting about this approach is we found that it plays really nicely with the CSS ecosystem. With a lot of these CSS and JavaScript approaches, they were having to kind of reinvent the wheel in a lot of ways. But for us, because we were using Webpack and we were using loaders, we could just chain them together. Here you can see, CSS loader is right in the middle of less loader and auto prefixer loader. So we could use preprocessors, we could auto prefix our classes for cross-browser compatibility. We could plug it into like linting tools and whatever else you want to use. For us, that was a real productivity boost, and it meant that we could bet more safely on this approach in the long term, whereas CSS and JavaScript was still very much unknown territory. This made it very easy for us to get people on board internally, because you look at this and it just felt like regular old CSS. You were getting this crazy boost in maintainability, but it didn't feel like something really, really different. I wrote about our approach in a blog post called Block Element Modifying Your JavaScript Components. I was really excited about this approach. I really wanted to share it with the world. And I thought this is where we were going to stay for quite a while. But something interesting happened on the side. A new feature landed in Webpack's CSS loader called Local Scope. And basically what Local Scope did was change everything. So if you look at the top of that file we had earlier, where you would require a CSS file, that's very uncommon in Node land, right? To just require something as a pure side effect. Instead, with local scope, you could actually import styles from a CSS file. Now, the first reaction you might have looking at that second line is, what does that styles thing evaluate to? If I'm importing something from a CSS file, like, what is it? Is it the contents of the file? It's a bit strange. So to make sense of that line, we're first going to look at the CSS. So this new syntax was introduced. You wrap this :local around a selector. So here we've got a header and a footer class. And that had some interesting effects on the CSS. So what that meant is that when you imported that styles object from the CSS file, you now had an object with references to the header and the footer. So you can see now in our div, we're attaching classes for styles.header and styles.footer. It's much more explicit now, the relationship between the classes that we're getting from that file and how they relate to the DOM in our React component. To make a bit more sense out of this, if you look at what came out the other end when you compiled the CSS, what started as these locally scoped, human-readable classes turned into globally unique hashes. The big thing to realize with this now is that we have no more naming collisions. You're free to call things whatever you want. You can have 12 header classes in your app, and as long as they're in different files, you're okay, just like when we work in JavaScript and you don't have to worry about clashing variable names in your modules. It was much, much easier for us to manage. And that styles object, all it did was map that human-readable name that you provided to the globally unique hash. So when you say that this div has a class of styles.header, what you're actually saying is its class is that thing there, which I'm not going to attempt to read out. Now, if for some reason, particularly in development, you want to have nicer names for these classes, it was completely configurable. So you could tell CSS Loader that you want the local identifier name to be the name of the file, 2 underscores, and then the name of the local. So effectively what you're doing here is you're getting that BEM notation for free out of your build system. And it was much, much easier to maintain, much easier to look at as well. Now, at Seek, we were already sort of working with this BEM style, locally scoping everything to the component, as I talked about before. So as soon as we saw this feature, we couldn't help but go all in. And it really didn't take long for us to port the entire code base over to using local scope. It was a natural fit. But what that resulted in is something really interesting. We had basically any CSS file in the application that you looked at would just be a wall of local, everything local, 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 all the way down. Eventually, you'd come to the very odd exception, like in the case of React, when we were using CSS Transition Group, what you would do with CSS Transition Group is style the classes that introduced differently. And those classes are globally scoped, so we wouldn't localize those. But that was really the exception. Now, we looked at that, and a natural question started to come out, given the sheer number of these local selectors throughout our app. We said, what if locally scoped CSS was the default? You look at any other tool that we were working with, JavaScript. If you wanted something to be global, you had to go out of your way to put it on window. It was not something that happened by accident. You very much had to go out of your way to globalize something. Why is our CSS any different? So what we did is we opened up a new tab in our editor and we experimented just with the API. We said, what if we could transform this automatically? What if we could drop all of that local, all of that noise around all of the selectors and just write the classes? If we needed to have a global class in that odd exception, we flipped the model around. We said, what if we had :global? So in this case, we're saying our locally scoped panel class nested inside it is a global class called transition active enter. And this worked amazingly well for us because in our app, we only had global styles in the normalize CSS and in these transition classes, and that was it. Everything else was locally scoped. And so with this simple change, this would make things a lot better for our code base. So luckily, there's a really fantastic tool, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, called PostCSS. They call themselves a post processor, but basically, it's a preprocessor that you can write plugins for in JavaScript. And so with very little code and not a lot of time, we created this simple plugin called PostCSS Local Scope. And its job was just to make that transformation that we talked about earlier, which is turning .class into :local.class. And of course, it also had room for :global. So it would, if it saw a global notation around a class, it would leave that untouched. It would leave that as a global class. This work that we put into this little project and all the thinking behind it, I wrote up about it in another blog post called The End of Global CSS. Now, I was really surprised to see that this blog post really took off and got a lot of people talking about it. But for me, most importantly, it got the attention of Tobias Koppers, who created Webpack. He reached out to me on Gitter and said, I hope it's okay if I integrate PostCSS local scope into the CSS loader. And of course, what am I going to say to that? It's a definite yes. So shortly after that, we got an experimental feature in CSS Loader called Module Mode. All you had to do was add $module to your CSS Loader, and you would start to get this built in. In my blog post, another thing I sort of raised as an idea for the future, I said that we could start generating shared classes between components automatically, treating style reuse as an optimization at compile time. And what I meant by that is, if you look at that styles object that you import, there's this one-to-one mapping. If you say styles.foo is actually mapped to this global myComponentFoo, your component actually doesn't really care about the implementation of that class. So you could just as easily swap this out for a many-to-one. You've got this one style name that actually maps to 3 classes, or it could be as many as you want. And so that creates a lot of interesting room to kind of refactor your CSS without even touching your markup at all. Tobias Coppers is a machine. He takes these ideas, these threads, and just builds entire new features overnight. So to my excitement, we had this new feature composition that came out basically within a few days. So what you would do is you would take this class, and if you wanted to say it was actually made up of other classes, you would just say that it composes the heading class from typography.css, it composes the box class from layout, and then when you use this class in your app, it's actually going to be made up of 3 classes, the original class you defined and the 2 you're composing. So if you look at those files, they're just regular CSS again, with no special syntax. You just write .heading, .box, the kind of classes that in a typical application are way too generic and would cause a lot of issues. With CSS written with this special module syntax, we completely sidestep those issues. So again, when you look at that styles object, it's really just 3 classes mapped to a single name that you insert into your document. As we were working on these features, I reached back out to Tobias on Gitter and I said to him, have you thought about writing a standard for CSS modules that others could implement? What you're doing could totally fix the CSS ecosystem if it's widely adopted. And again, not long after we had this conversation, a new organization fired up on GitHub, a new repo with a big README describing what CSS modules are, in the hope that we can start to kind of get this beyond just being a feature hidden within Webpack, basically. So I created the CSS modules logo, first as a joke, but it kind of stuck. And it's no longer marked as experimental. We also added an S to the end of the option once we formalized the name. So now you have CSS Loaders modules mode, and you get this built in. So a lot of you are going to be using CSS Loader right now. So you already, if you're not already, you already have CSS modules built in, and you can just turn it on as easy as that. There's a bunch of us working on it. It's not just Tobias, and it's not just me. Really what we're trying to do is make this into a real thing that's not just built into Webpack, not just for React. This is just trying to fix some of the fundamental problems we have with CSS, and we're still not entirely sure where we're going with this, which is pretty exciting to me. So yeah, we've got it in Webpack, as I said, but we've also got it working in Browserify, JSPM as well. But there's a big word out there, not just within the JavaScript community, of course, but people use CSS everywhere. So if you feel that your build tool is missing, or your language, or the environment that you work in, I really would encourage you to look at how you could contribute to our efforts. It'd be really great to get CSS modules, making CSS more maintainable for everybody, not just the people in this room. Now, Michael Jackson said this on Twitter very recently. He said, I'm really encouraged by the work on CSS modules, though it only fixes part of the problem. And, you know, I agree. Like, CSS modules is by no means finished. Like I said, we're not entirely sure where we're going with this, which I like. But, you know, there's some big things that are missing. One thing that's actually about to land in CSS Modules 1.0 is a feature we're calling values, written by Glenn Madden on the CSS Modules team, a friend of mine from Melbourne as well. And basically, values let you define these simple values that you can just plug into your CSS. That's not new in the world of preprocessors, but what's really great about them is that they work really well with CSS modules in general. So what you can do, for example, is you can build a breakpoints.css file, and you can define the values right there, give them nice, meaningful names. You can import these into other CSS files or into your JavaScript. So if you look at this component here, what it's doing is it's importing a value from breakpoints.css, and then it's plugging it into a media query. So standardizing media queries across your files is now something that just is part of CSS if you're using CSS modules. The other big problem, and probably the harder problem, one that's keeping me up at night basically, is theming. There's 2 problems with theming. The first one is around overriding styles, but I actually think this is the problem that's kind of already got some good solutions out there. Some of you might already be familiar with a pretty small project of mine called React Themable. And the idea with this project is to try and make it so that styles are just props to components. If you import a third-party component and you want to override its styles with your own, in the olden days what you would do is just write a bunch of global CSS with bang important everywhere to try and override their stuff. we're trying to make this a bit more of a first-class part of components. So especially those of you who are component authors, maybe pay close attention to this because I'd like to get some more support on this approach. The idea is that with your component, like I said, you just pass in a theme as a prop, and you can completely customize the way it looks. So as a real-world example, here we've created a theme for this component, and we've just defined some classes that will be part of its public API. And then inside of your React component where you're rendering it, you can import the theme from your CSS file, so it's a CSS module. And then here we've got kind of this first-class CSS module. We're passing the object right down into the component, and the component can use that instead of its default. Now, component authors are going to look at this and say, like, yeah, that's great, but the world doesn't revolve around CSS modules. There's a lot of different approaches out there. And I completely agree. The last thing I want to do is create some kind of like monoculture around CSS modules. So what I did with React Themable was make it so that it kind of worked with as many different approaches as possible. Here you see using it with Radium. We're creating a style sheet in Radium. We're wrapping that component with Radium's decorator, and then we're passing in the theme. And this works great. You've also got support for JSS, another great project in this space. Here we're building up a JSS style sheet, attaching it to the DOM, and then we're handing it the sheet's classes down into the component. That works as well. We've got inline styles. If you just write a standard object literal, there's nothing fancy going on here, but you can just pass that right in, and it works fine. What's really interesting is that after I came out with React Themable, this pattern actually landed in React. Not so much the working across the different styles of CSS that are out in the wild, but this idea of like a first-class CSS module, it's already there in React 0.14. So basically what happens now is when you use the transition group, where previously you would provide a transition name and it was just a string that would be prefixed to these global classes, now what you can do is you can pass in an object that maps these enter, interactive, leave, and so on. You map them to global classes. So a common use case would be something like this, where you might have some BEM-style classes in the global scope, and you're saying to React's transition group that you want to map to these global classes you've defined. But that looks very familiar, doesn't it? I mean, essentially, that is what we get from a CSS module. So that allows a really interesting pattern. It means that you can define your transitions in a simple file like this, and you can just call them .enter, .enter active, and so on. You don't have to come up with some new name for it in the global scope. And then what you can do is you can import the styles from that transition file, and you can pass it down as the transition name. Essentially the same pattern that we've seen in React Themable, but this is in React Core. The other problem with theming, and it's the big problem with theming that's caused a lot of debate, is how do you override theme variables? If you think about something like Bootstrap, where the way you work with it typically is you override the built-in variables in their preprocessor. It's a very roundabout way to achieve what's very natural in JavaScript, because essentially what you kind of want is to have functions in your CSS. You want to be able to import someone's theme, which is a function, pass it in some overrides, and out the other end comes some CSS. Now, if you think earlier to our desire for CSS and JavaScript, one of the big reasons we're attracted to it is because it just simplifies a lot of things. JavaScript is just a better programming language than any preprocessor. It's much more widely supported. It has a great package manager behind it in the form of NPM. We really want to leverage this ecosystem. So one thing I've been experimenting with wildly is something I really want to share with you today. It's definitely not a complete idea, but that's sort of the idea. I kind of want to get some feedback on it and get some input. Before I continue, I really wanted to add a disclaimer here. The views expressed in this presentation are not necessarily the views of the CSS Modules team. This is the source of much debate. So CSS modules in JavaScript. That's kind of the idea that I'm playing with. It seems to contradict the whole point of CSS modules, but I don't know, it's interesting to me. Because if you look at the way you use loaders in Webpack, you can just chain them together quite simply. You might have a preprocessor before the CSS loader, but if the preprocessor is transforming one file type into another, what's to say that you can't have some other loader in there that takes in JavaScript and outputs CSS? Now, the point I want to make today to try and inspire hopefully a few of you is that CSS modules, I think, make a great compilation target. Why is that? If you compile something into a CSS module, what you get is first-class Webpack support. You can just plug into all the other tools out there, which means you get local scoping for free. Your CSS in JavaScript solution doesn't have to worry about this problem at all. It's a solved problem. You can extract a CSS file with standard tooling. Again, this is something that we're already doing in Webpack. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And more importantly, I think for people working on these new projects, especially those of us who don't have a whole lot of free time to do this stuff, really what you want to do is you want to focus on the API, not the tooling. So luckily for us, Andre Pop again has inspired me with his open source work. He created a really great project called Styling. And it's probably the thing that really got me thinking about this solution. So the idea of styling is that rather than writing a CSS file, where typically if you wanted more functionality, you might write a Sass file. Instead of reaching for Sass, just reach for plain old JavaScript. In this case, we're importing this styling library. We're importing a color library that we pulled off NPM. We've got primary colors. Here we've got values, right? We can just import values from other JavaScript files. And then we export these named styles, wrapping them with this styling function call. And it's just JavaScript. You can do anything JavaScript can do. But I think more importantly, the social factor around JavaScript is really important. All of the functionality on NPM is available to you. And anything that you do to solve these CSS-related problems, you can just wrap it up in a function and publish it. It's really great. And configuring it is nice and easy. In your Webpack configuration, when you wire up the loader for any file, in this case that ends in .style.js, you're saying that it first needs to run through Babel before going through styling, and then after that it needs to go through CSS loader and style loader. I threw my hat in the ring to try and get my head around this problem. I created a very small loader called JSS loader. It's not production ready, it's very much an experiment, but I just wanted to test the waters in this space. And this is kind of what it looks like. So it's very much inspired by styling as well. What you do is you can, again, you can import values from other files. Here we're importing a function, breakpoints as a function. It's like mixin. So here we're using the object spread notation to say that this selector inside, it also has a large screen breakpoint with a different padding value. Now, in this case, wiring up is even simpler, but that is a source of its limitations, so I will warn about that. The loaders here, we've got style loader, but that comes after CSS loader with modules mode, but more importantly, before that, it runs through JSS loader, and it's as simple as that. And the great thing about using something like JSS, again, it fits in with this idea of trying not to reinvent too many wheels. JSS is a really great tool. It's really good at what it does. It's basically, if you think of it as a preprocessor for CSS made with JavaScript, there's already a plugin ecosystem around it to do things like nested selectors and extends, automatic pixel values, camel case, sorting of props, that sort of thing. And if you want to make more plugins, you just plug into JSS rather than into some weird thing I invented, which is really cool. The big concern for me, and this is where a lot of the debate comes in, is how does this affect the approachability of CSS modules? The interesting thing about working in the open source space is that our main concern is not just creating the best thing possible, because if no one uses it, it's not that interesting, really. For us, it's really important that we raise the quality of CSS across the board, try and get everybody thinking about writing CSS in this modular fashion, thinking about component-driven design. And I think there's a real risk that the further you kind of go in the deep end with some of these approaches, the more you're going to just lose the wider web community. So there's a real balancing act here. For me, and the rest of the CSS team, what a CSS modules team, what do you do at these decision points? It's really not easy. We want to make CSS as powerful as possible, but we don't want to break the language or make it into something too esoteric. And this is where your input is going to be really important. If you want to talk to me about this during the conference or on Twitter afterwards, I'd love to talk to you about it. But more importantly, I want you to experiment with us. I think there's a lot of room to try some new things in this space, to try to improve CSS, maybe to make CSS modules a common compilation target for CSS and JS. It's definitely something that we don't know where we're going, and people like you are going to help drive the future. It's also worth stressing that CSS modules, my addition to really kicking that off was relatively minor. It was a small amount of pretty crappy code. I've since improved it, but the point is that it started off with a very simple decision to improve the interface for developers, focusing on that developer experience, and the rest will come. I want to end by saying that the community around React is really, really impressive. And when I say React, of course, I should be a bit more inclusive. It's not just React. There's a lot of great libraries out there in languages, Elm, Cycle.js, some really great work happening. And in the CSS community in particular, there's just a lot of people trying different things. It seems like when it comes to Flux, we've largely landed on Redux by the sounds of it, but CSS by no means has sort of ended up in that space. I think CSS modules is the closest we've got to a consensus. I hear a lot of people using CSS modules, but I don't think we're finished. And it's really exciting that so many people care about this problem. That's it for me. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for listening to my talk.
Great. Cool. So we have time to go roughly through 4, 5, 6 questions in a timely manner, and then we're going to go for lunch.
I'm going to skip the troll question. I mean, what do I say to that? Thank you. Andre, Andre was a proponent of CSS modules for a while. His question is about the wall he hit about the lack of constant sharing. Hopefully values in CSS modules addresses this problem. Using Freestyle. Freestyle is great. I had a look at it as a result of your tweet, and I'm actually, I think it's the first thing that I've seen that really makes me think about it as an alternative for me in my project to CSS modules. Its killer feature is that it can render the CSS for just the things you see on screen, whereas something like CSS modules, you kind of have to just bring in a bundle of all styles in the app. So I think we're still trying to address these problems, but by all means, use what works best for you. I'm not here to sell you on CSS modules. I kind of answered the second one as well. So values in CSS modules coming in 1.0, so keep an eye out for that. Talking about CSS and JS, how to manage selecting of parents, siblings, since we can't rely on CSS now. Well, I think the design patterns in something like BEM, it's all about kind of trying to minimize this sort of stuff. We do very simple nesting in our applications, but the really good thing about CSS modules is that it scopes it to the one file. So when we do nesting, it's only nesting within the rules of a single file. We definitely don't nest across component boundaries in the CSS. If you want a component to look different depending on its context, we make that a prop of the React component. So if a component can be in like a primary or secondary mode, if it's a button, for example, you don't make that depend on whether it's in a certain parent. You make that a prop of the component, and that leads to much more maintainable code, much more testable code. Doesn't local scope feature bind your CSS to Webpack forever? This is exactly the line of thought that led to CSS modules being extracted from Webpack. My feeling is that as much as I love using Webpack, CSS modules, the idea in it was much greater, I think, than any one tool, and really deserved to be something that you could use anywhere. So, like I said, we need the help of the community to continue this effort, but we don't want to couple you to Webpack. We want you to have modular CSS no matter where you are. I guess I'll answer one more. I'm going to pick the best one. Let's see. Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Andre pops one. So as far as I know, composers can result in non-deterministic style overrides. How to solve that? That's a really good question, and it's something that is probably one of the areas that we need a bit more tooling around. The idea that we're floating at the moment, just to clarify the problem, when you're composing multiple classes into one, imagine that you're composing 5 classes, and for all you know, like 2 of them might actually be defining a rule for the same property. So now you've got this situation where the rule that wins is kind of determined by the source order, which is completely abstracted from you, right? When you use a tool like Webpack, you can't say that this class should be in the file before that one. So that's kind of one of those things that you can't, I'm not sure how you solve that. The idea that we're working on at the moment is it's going to be like in some sort of linting tool perhaps that'll warn you and say like, hey, you just shouldn't do this. It's actually a bad idea. But you know, that still has to come. So in the meantime, tread carefully and hopefully we'll have a better answer for that soon. That's it. So I'm going to be around the conference, of course. So please, I'm alone in a foreign city. Come talk to me. I'd love to talk to you. Even if I look like I don't want to be bothered, I do. So come talk to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.